Hello, Build. Super excited to be here this morning. Thank you for joining Chris and I. We're here to walk you through build full stack applications with Azure Static Web Apps and Azure SQL Database. Chris, I think we have possibly the longest build title.
I tend to agree, but yeah, Azure Static Web Apps, SQL Database, that's what we're doing today.
Yes, it's a great topic. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah. I am a academic advocate, which means I get the privilege to work with higher education students and universities. Chris is one of my peers. I am from the United States. Fun fact, I am on the East Coast. I watched the sunrise this morning. I've got a full cup of coffee in my, my most favorite mug, ready to go. We're going to have fun for the next hour. Chris, welcome to all of our friends at Build. Tell them about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, as Sarah was saying, we're on the same academic team. I'm Chris Noring. I am in London, so it's just short of lunchtime, but I still need another coffee, right?
Yes. Excellent. So, all right, let's get going. We've got a full hour to share with you. I was going to say this morning, but today, here is the link with AKA MS Learn Live to the module we're going to go through. You can also get the QR code that will take you right there. You can walk through it with us, but we encourage you to just kind of participate and talk and share. This will be recorded. You can watch it later, and we'd love to have you participate and chat with us while we're going through this all together. All right. We also have, let's get to our learning objectives. I got so excited about the people we have to chat with us. All right, so for this module, our learning objectives are we're going to create an Azure Static Web App. We're going to talk about APIs, SQL database. This, I think, module is really cool. It gives you options in different languages. I think there's C#, Node, and Python in this module. So we're going to get into that. Chris will walk us through some database and some APIs. And then we get to look at some GitHub actions to build the CI/CD pipeline and how those get deployed. We're going to walk you through all of that, all those great stuff. And we also have people that are joining us in the chat. We've got Laurent, our producer. Simona is there to answer all of your questions. Please feel free to ask anything that you have. They would be happy to answer. And yes, I know Chris and I just shared where we're from. I'd love to hear where everybody else is from. I think Build is just a great place. We have a global audience, which is so fun. I'm getting very little sleep, but it is all great stuff. All right, Chris. I think we covered all the start of it. So you ready to go?
I am ready. Are you ready?
Let's go. Yes. Okay, so here we go. What we're looking at is the Azure Static Web Apps, and how we talk about how it combines the power of app service and Azure functions. So you can publish static web pages with associated APIs with ease. I am super excited. I love this because I've done a lot with app services. I've also kind of found my way around until we had static web apps through hosting static apps through blob storage and the CDN. So when static web apps was announced, I was very excited. So it's cool that we get to talk about this today. We highlighted the section there. We're going to focus on the whole scenario in the learning module is about buses. So we want to track buses where they're at in terms of an user's location so they know when they need to leave to get on the bus. So when you go through the whole learning path for this, it talks kind of through the devices, the JSON, how that data comes from the bus, how we store that, and then how that all kind of leads to the web page, which we're going to look at today. And the parts that we're going to start with is the SQL database. We're going to get to the API, and then we're going to build the website off of that. Some prerequisites to get started: ability to navigate to the Azure portal, the familiarity with Visual Studio Code. There's some great extensions in there if you haven't explored those yet. and then familiarity with CI/CD concepts. Also, if you don't have an Azure account, we got you covered, right? There's a few links for you. Just go to azure.microsoft.com free. If you are a student, there's also a link that will get you going there as well.
Just one short add there, Sarah. For this module, the only thing you need to do is to make sure that you're signed up to learn, then you will be able to use the sandbox. So for the sake of this module, you don't actually need an Azure account. But if you want to do this in your own free time, as you were saying there, Sarah, sign up for free or sign up as a student, you will get some credits.
Yes, definitely. Great point. All right. We've got the app architecture. Chris, you want to walk us through this?
I will. And yeah, so if you don't know by now, there's a subliminal message. I'm not going to say where it is. You have to figure that out. We are looking at the application architecture, and I thought of it in terms of layers, or we did. So at the bottom layer, the squishy layer, you have the database because you want to store your data somewhere. And for the sake of this exercise, we will be using Azure SQL, which is a great choice. There are many choices out there, Cosmos, Postgres. You can really use what you want, but for the sake of this exercise, for the sake of this module, we had to make a choice. Now, in the middle layer, the GUI middle layer, we're going to use APIs and we're going to use Azure Functions. Azure Functions are great. They are based on an event-based architecture, and they have a very nice pricing. There are different pricing models, but among them is pay for what you use. So that's great if you're just starting out, you're prototyping, or you might be a startup. At the top, we are using HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and also a very fun component called OpenLayer. Now, this is a library that Sarah will show you all how you can actually draw up a map and see where you are on the map and where the bus is at. So that's why we're using OpenLayer. But all the rest, that's just vanilla JavaScript. For those of you who haven't heard the term vanilla, that just means that we are not using a framework. So vanilla means nothing, essentially. So database, and what do we need to store in there? Well, just to give you an idea what's actually in there, there is a database layer. We're not there yet, but just for the sake of it, we will be using a table called bus data. So inside of bus data, it tells us where is our bus currently. And there's a bunch of geofence tables that we'll be using. Geofences for the bus and you. And we'll also use a table called monitored routes that keeps track of that specific route that you care about. And then there's the routes table finally, which contains every single bus route in Seattle. I don't know about you all, if you've been to Seattle. I've been to Seattle. There are many buses, many routes. I'm kind of happy that there's a table that keeps track of everything. Sarah, when were you latest in Seattle?
I was actually there for the first time 2 weeks ago. I've been at Microsoft now for a couple years, finally got to see campus. It's beautiful, beautiful.
Nice, very nice. Yeah, I've been there for I think a couple of years ago. I'm still to visit that treehouse of ours, but I know it's in there, so I probably need a map with an X on it.
I got you.
Yes, Sarah, maybe you can tell our viewers what a geofence is, because they might not know what it is.
Yes. So a geofence is basically how I think of it is the space around me, right? Or in terms of me, the space around my kids. Like how many miles around are they, and when do they leave that space? Or in this case, it's I want a certain circumference maybe around me of time or distance so that I know when I need to catch the bus. Super important for someone like me because if it takes me 14 minutes to get somewhere, I will leave at 13 minutes and 59 seconds. So a geofence kind of allows you to set a boundary of, in this case, when the bus enters that fence, I need to start walking so I can catch it.
You make me reminisce of old times. I wasn't so much walking to the bus, but running. And, I was probably around somewhere between 12 and 16, remembering I'm going to make this, I'm going to make this. So I'm full on running. Think Usain Bolt running. So, yeah. For this one, now we have actually come to the exercise. So the first thing we're going to do here is to set up our database. We will have to make sure we get the tables we need. the table structure, and the data in there. So once we establish that foundational layer, we're able to build things on top of it, right? Imagine that we are in the sponge cake level of things. So I'm going to switch over here to the Learn module itself. So this is where you can go on Learn to search for this module called Build Serverless Full Stack Application in Azure. That's the entire path. There's a lot of really great parts in here, but the one that we are going to take is called Build Full Stack Applications with Azure Static Web Apps and Azure SQL Database. So we're going to navigate in there. There are a few parts. There are 3 exercises in total that we will go through today, hopefully. If we don't have time completely, we will have to make sure that we at least guide you. So bear with us, and hopefully we will get through all of it. Now, for the first exercise, I want to call out the fact that you are using a sandbox. That's what this gray area is. If you're logged on, you will be able to click Activate Sandbox, in which case you don't have to care about using any of your Azure credits at this point. What you want to do, though, is to make sure that you're set up nicely for the future. So we do recommend installing an editor. Our suggestion is Visual Studio Code, because if you install that, you will have access to some great extension that will really improve that developer experience of yours. Because we will be using Azure Functions, we also recommend using the Azure Function Core tools. This is a library that you will need to run and debug and do things like that with your Azure Functions, which is your API layer. Now, once you have Visual Studio Code, you are really nicely set up, and there are some extensions here that it's really nice for you to install additionally, which is the one called the Azure account, the Azure Functions. The one about GitHub, you don't have to have this one, but it's kind of nice to have this UI when you work with code, right? And then you have Azure Resources, if you want to see what resources you have been deploying. SQL Server comes with its own extension as well. And also Live Server is another one of our recommendations. Now, I want to make sure you stay awake for this one. So one thing you will need to do is to create this GitHub account, because we will be using GitHub heavily. So make sure that you're set up on GitHub. And one of the first things we really want to make sure that you get right as you start with this module is to click this link that leads to a repository. So I don't know if you see the bottom here, but this is pointing to a sample repo that we want you to fork. Once you fork it, it will look something like this. So you will have your own version of this repo. And now you are in a nice place. You're nicely set up. You have application code. You have some script code that's going to help you deploy things, and even slides in there. So yeah, quite a lot of things here that echoes what we're saying today. Let's pretend that you've all forked this repo already. Once you've done that, that's great. You want to clone this repo so you can work with it locally. It's actually possible to go through with this module and just work in GitHub if you want to. That's perfectly fine as well. Now, one thing you want to do, though, is when you move from this point, you want to be using PowerShell. So one of the first things you want to do, if you're not starting in a PowerShell shell, you want to hit PWSH, which is an acronym for starting the PowerShell shell. Once you're there, we need to find out the IP address, because we will use that in an argument as we set up the database, and I will just show you how. So by running this command here, invoke web request to this service, it will tell you back what the IP is. Now, because we are deploying a database, there are a few parameters that we need to set, a few variables. First off, this is the username that you will use in the database. You are free to choose what this should be, but we have some options for you, and if you use that, the rest of the exercise is going to flow nicely. Now, as with the password, this needs to be complicated enough, so make sure you mix big letters, small letters, and also a special character, and it's going to turn out happy. This is where you set the IP address value that you previously asked for via this command up here. So once you set those, you're almost there. I wanted to call your attention to this square bracket thing. Once you click Activate Sandbox, this will actually be replaced towards the default Sandbox resource group name, so you don't have to fill this in. Next order of business is that we fetch the resource group by doing that. And what we really want to do with that is we want the location. So once we have the location, we want to make sure the database is being deployed in the same location as that of the resource group. And for those of you who don't know exactly what I'm saying right now with resource group, think of resource group as a logical bucket, like for your project, where all the resources that you might possibly use fit in there. It could be a database, could be static web apps, could be something else. What you want to do next is to create a server name that's globally unique. That's what we're trying to do here. So we create this prefix called bus-server, and then we have generated this unique ID. If possible, I recommend adding even more stuff to this, like Sarah or Chris or whatever your name is, to make sure that server name is unique. Then you have a database name. Now you actually all set up to create and provision these resources on Azure. So the first order of business is to create the Azure SQL Server. And one thing we can see here is how we're using the resource group name, the server name, the location, and also we set some administrator credentials with our username and password in there. So once we have that server created, next order of business is to define some firewall rules, because the approach we are using here is to allow our local IP to access this database. And I can imagine that a few of you who listen to this is like, wait a minute, am I actually allowing my own personal IP address into the cloud? Is that really secure? Well, there are better approaches to this one, but for the sake of this exercise, for the sake of this module, this is how we're going to do things to keep things simple. But probably in a production scenario, you might not want to allow a specific IP to access your database, but rather have a different access level. But yeah, the second order of business is another rule, and this is essentially saying we are allowing all the Azure IPs. So if a resource that's already deployed in the cloud try to access your database, that should be fine as well. But again, all of this is to make it easier for the sake of the exercise. Last thing to be provisioned is the database itself. Now, so far, you're kind of wondering, wait a minute, didn't you just deploy an Azure SQL Server? Why do I need a database too? Well, here's the thing. A Azure SQL Server can exist with many databases on it. So you have to see this as a one-to-many. So yeah, you need a server and at least one database in there. The database is what's going to keep our data. Now, one thing I want to call out here is the serverless bit. Sarah, do you care to guess what the serverless one means, or you want me to explain?
Oh, this is very cool. I'd love for you to explain, because this is also a bit new for me. This is going to be a serverless SQL database, I'm assuming?
Yeah, you're correct. So the serverless bit in there, the compute model, means that our database, instead of being open for business 24/7, is actually going to save your wallet a little bit by powering down when you're not using it. We will demonstrate this later, because we will see that our application later, as we deploy it, isn't quite working. And that's really how it should be working, because if it's serverless, it has the ability to power down when you're not using it. And that's a very nice behavior as we're just starting things out. As long as we can wake it up, right? Just like we're waking up Sarah today with, 5 cups of coffee, right?
It's going to be at least.
Great. So imagine with me here, imagine that we are not in Kansas anymore. We have deployed all our cloud resources, and that's great. But there's a thing we need to do to actually make things work. What we haven't done at this point is to kick off a job that will create the needed data table. So what do? Well, there are two things we need to do. One of them is to make sure that we have a way for our deployment file to find their way to the database. And yeah, so once we provisioned our database, we need to go into the portal azure.com, or we could use the Azure CLI tool to find out what is the connection string of our deployed database. Once we have that, we need to go into the settings here of our repo and into the secrets compartment. So once we go in here, we need to establish a couple of secrets. Now, because I've already deployed this one before, all the secrets are already in place. But when you're starting out, this is a complete blank. So yeah, here you're setting up Azure SQL connection string with a value, and you get that value, as I said, either from the portal or from the CLI tool. What it's giving you in the portal, I believe, is a connection string that it hasn't typed in the password, so you might need to modify it before pasting it. And I can hear what you're saying. Okay, Chris, I've created my secret, but why did I create it? Well, if you look under this subfolder here, under .github, under workflows, there's a file that when you start out, it's slightly differently named. It's called Azure SQL Database.yml.template. So in this case, I've already deployed it. I've already kicked it off, but humor with me. Imagine that this hasn't been kicked off yet, at which point in here, we now have this. We have YAML. So if you've never seen YAML before, this is a configuration language that tells you what it will do when you try to kick things off. So this one, for example, is saying when you're trying to push to main, or you have a pull request on main, then I'm going to do something. And that something is on line 13 saying I'm going to deploy a database. We're looking at an action. It's using a predefined action. We don't need to create that ourselves, but it is using our connection string, meaning that now it will know how to reach our database, and it will apply a package here, a DACPack package. And this one gives us a good clue what's going on. Okay, so there's supposed to be a database folder somewhere in this repo. Let's actually see what that looks like. So if we look here from the root, we see we have database, we have DACPack, and we see here how we have the bus-db DACPack. Now, this is a binary file, and we can't really read it. But what I can tell you that it does is that it contains create statements for our database and its tables. If you're really curious what that looks like, we can just jump up one level and go to the notebooks department. So if you want to see completely what that file is doing for you, it's in here. So you can see how it would do create table of routes. It would do create table of route data, and it would create a lot of other necessary tables such as monitored routes, the geofence tables that Sarah was explaining what those were. And yeah, so finally, when it's done creating all those tables, these are the tables that you end up with. So if you ever wondered about that backup database file, here are the actual explicit instructions that it's running. So great. Imagine now that I've actually gone into that file that I said I've already renamed and thus rename it. That means it will kick off an action. And to see an action being kicked off, you should be going into the actions folder. And this is a folder that we have a reason to revisit later on, as Sarah explains how we create these static web apps. So you see there's a lot of jobs here that is kicking off. And here you can see how I initially renamed the template file when it was called Azure SQL Database.yaml.template to Azure SQL Database.yaml. So as part of that program, you can see that, oh, it was running a deploy job. It was all happy days. We saw that green checkbox and our database was established. So that's super. So that actually concludes the first exercise. What you also can do, no, sorry, I was too early. One more step. At this point, we have created our tables, but we haven't created our data. My recommendation at this point is that you take what's coming in here, all of these scripts that are seeding our database with data, go into portalazure.com to your SQL Server resource and just paste this into an editor, and it's going to kick this off. So it will seed it with the route data. You might wonder what's going on here. Well, we actually have a blob storage here that is pointing to. So this is pointing to a CSV file of routes.txt. If you ever wonder what that actually means, let's see if we can find that. This is what it looks like. So if you were to follow the path of this blob storage, you would end up with this. And this is every single bus route in Seattle. So if you've been to Seattle, you might recognize Madison Park or Docton or some other places in here. But yeah, the gist of all this is that, okay, this is our data. It's being inserted. Once it's done inserting, our database is up and it is ready to go. So yeah, so that was all the deployment steps of configuring, deploying the database with PowerShell, configuring the database and mucking about with GitHub Actions to make sure it has access to the database. is able to kick off that job into the actions folder, as I was showing you. And lastly, that we imported a bunch of data. Now, as you try to verify all of this, go into portalazure.com, choose the query editor, log on with your credentials that you have, your admin name, your password, and you will be shown the thing here at the bottom right, and you can, for example, type select star from routes. You should be seeing all of these routes. If you're here, if everything works as it should, you're good. Now, as for the API, when it comes to building applications, we will do that using Azure Functions. So you might have seen the image that Sarah presented initially. There was a lot of things going on. Applications such as these bus applications, they can be super, super complicated. But in our case, we have three components: the website, the API, and the database. And yeah, the middle layer is really Azure Functions at this point. So you can see here on the right how the API fits on the right side of things within the Azure Static Web Apps container. Sarah will explain more about Azure Static Web Apps itself, but you can see that those two kind of sits together. And if you look on the left side of things here, you see that we have GitHub Actions, we have Azure DevOps, and now we also have a third route of doing things, which is the Azure Static Web Apps CLI that's able to just deploy, and it's not using GitHub Actions, it's just deploying your files as is. So imagine that the CLI here is the third invisible choice that you could be using. Right, now to the API layer, we have now moved on from the bottom cake here in the GUI middle, and I'm starting to see some really good stuff here. The GUI middle, the API layer, what it's doing is that it's executing some Node.js code. I should mention that if you want to use, I think, .NET or Python, we have pivots within the Learn module. We have code in the repos. You can use those instead. So .NET, Python, Node.js, use what works for you. This is the Node.js code. What I wanted to highlight is that the first thing it does is to grab a hold of the Azure SQL connection string. It is reading this value from the environment variables. And once it has that value, it tries to connect towards the database using the MS SQL SDK. It is sending through two query parameters, read and gid, which stands for route ID and geofence ID. Once it has those two, it's executing a stored procedure. And at the bottom here, it's taking the location data, which is the response, and returns that back as a JSON to the frontend. Yeah, so I believe it is back to you, Sarah.
Yes, thanks for walking us through all that, Chris. That was really good. I love how the module gets you the SQL, and breaking down and understanding those pieces is very helpful. And yes, good tip about the password, because I fell into the trap where build is great, all lowercase, and then it'll tell you. That's one thing about the module, right? It'll tell you when you need to do something a little different. Okay, so we've got our database now, we've got our API. So now what we're into is the challenges that the module is presenting us. So we need to create our static website up. We want to see the real-time bus data. We want to have a map, geofence, and we want to show bus init user, right? So this is where, if we think about that blue box, right, this is when Chris and I have to run for the bus as soon as it enters in that blue box, otherwise we're not going to make our stop. So this is what we're going to kind of walk through a bit on how we can build this out and what that looks like. So as we start that, let's talk about static web apps for a minute. So when we say static web apps, this means they're not server-side rendered, which essentially means that they're client-side rendered then. So client-side render means that a browser is going to pull down these files and then display them as the website. Whereas server-side rendered is, I'm going to make a call and it's going to go to the server and it will make whatever other request it needs to and then send me back down those files. So we're not interested in server-side rendering for static web apps, which is generally things like Angular, React, Svelte, Vue, jQuery. We have a great list here where there's no server-side rendering required, that this is all client-side. So these are all like great fits for static web apps, and it's also a great fit for our bus scenario. So let's go on. I think our next thing is we're going to deploy the static web app, right? Yes, let's walk through this a little bit. Okay, so deploying the static web app, there's kind of like Chris mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, which I love. We've got Visual Studio Code, Azure Portal, Azure CLI, and the Azure Static Web Apps CLI. So for me, I'm curious about everybody else. I like being in Visual Studio Code. I love the extensions. I love staying in that space. Chris, I'm curious, of all of these different flavors, how do you like when you're spinning up a static web app? What's your go-to?
Oh, excellent question there, Sarah. I've used Visual Studio Code in the past. I've definitely used Azure Portal, but I think my new favorite is CLI. And the reason why I prefer, I should say, the Azure Static Web Apps CLI. That's a handful to say. The reason that one is my favorite is that it does so much more than deployment. It's actually faking an authentication layer, and you do all of that locally, right? So imagine that you're creating your front end, you're creating your back end, and it's just able to, simulate the fact that how it's going to work, once you're in production. So I can feel confident about knowing that not only is it able to, deploy my front end and my back end, all of those things that usually go wrong, hello authentication, you can actually get some good feedback before you're deploying. And now it actually has the deployment capability. You might have seen, I think it was Wasim, but also Simona and a lot of other team members on Twitter talking about this at the just a few days ago, how it actually had the deployment capability. And by the way, a big congrats to Azure Static Web Apps on the 1 year, right, as a production server, so a service.
Yes. Yeah, great call out. That CLI is very cool. I still need to play with that a little more. I love what they're doing with that. Yes, so great things that we can all kind of explore. Yeah, so when we go to provision the static web app for this exercise, it's going to have us go to Portal, go to Static Web Apps in the search bar, and it'll take you right there. You'll see the icon. When you walk through that, we're going to connect that to our GitHub repo that Chris showed that we forked. And then the YAML file, which we already kind of got a teaser about how that's going to establish workflow. I think we looked at the database part, but we're going to look a little more, and we'll talk about some tricks to look at to make that a little bit more digestible as well.
Yeah, so maybe, Sarah, you can tell folks about the workflow that's being established as you provision the resource. What does that mean for our readers or viewers?
Yes, that's great. So when we go to static web apps, and we can look at that as well a little bit, what you're doing is you're going to say that, hey, I want to create a static web app that's from this branch of code. And it's going to authenticate, and it's going to kind of automatically, I always like to say, right, create your workflow file for you that will connect those both up. So one thing to kind of watch out for here is when it does this, you're going to have, I've fallen into this trap, so I'll warn you now. I'll have my code locally, and then I'll create my static web app, and it will create a workflow file, which basically says when there's a pull request to this repo, I'm going to do some action. And that will create that YAML file in your repo. So tip for you is always do a git pull after this if you're going to make changes locally. And you'll see this file. And we can look at it. I think maybe, Chris, we might switch to look at our sample here in just a second. But the things I like to look for here are, I've pointed out. So when it creates this workflow file, it may feel a little bit overwhelming at first because there's a lot in there. You don't really need to know all of the pieces in there. What I always like to do is just to give you some kind of bearings to look at. The first one is the top picture there. You'll see on. And then push branches. This is telling you which branches that it's kind of watching. So in this case, it's watching main. If you wanted it to watch other branches, you could add those as well. But this is kind of just the default that it's going to give you. And I think you also identify that when you set this up. So that's good to know what branches it's going to be watching. And then the build and deploy job, this is kind of what I think, Chris, you kind of talked about it too earlier, right? This is the meat of it. This is where it's going to actually do the work. And there again, we don't worry about all the details. You don't need to always be concerned with that. Azure does a great job taking care of that for you. The cool thing that I also pointed out was the secrets. So I think this is cool that you have a lot of access to secrets already, that they kind of give you, like you see the GitHub token, that's already there for you. The Azure Static Web Apps API token, it will add that for you. I think, Chris, you showed us, what was it, Azure SQL connection string? I can't remember the exact name of that secret. But you can add those as well, and they're there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly what you said there, Sarah. I was adding another secret, and I think that's one of the few secrets as part of this module that you actually have to add explicitly. And exactly what you called out there, the two other ones that you're looking at in this slide are actually created for you. So that's kind of nice to know, because as a developer, I always get a bit anxious looking at where do they get these parameters from? Do I need to set them? And if I was hearing you correctly here, Sarah, I don't need to set any of these two, right?
You don't. It will, when you go through and create your static web app, it will, when it asks you to identify like the repo, it's going to kind of build all of that for you. So once you have this workflow, you don't need to get in there and do anything with it. This was more just, just to be aware. And if you've fallen into traps like I have in the past, where I mess up my repo after it puts it there, it's good to know your bearings.
For sure. And I always think about this as a developer. I think experience is doing it in the 25 ways that don't work. So, if you haven't tried every single error path, you haven't really lived, right?
Exactly. That was me with the password in this example. I was like, come on, I've done everything. Then finally I was like, oh, I didn't do like uppercase. So, all right. I think at this point we're ready for a knowledge check. Chris, are you going to walk us through it?
Yeah, for sure. So we ask these knowledge checks to make sure that you are with us. So first off, I want to grab your attention to the bottom link here in yellow, aka.ms/polls-m. If you go in there, you will see this question being presented. Please answer as soon as you have a sense of what the answer should be. Now, for our first question, we're saying, what is the main value proposition of Azure Static Web Apps? And we have 4 different options for you, so think a little bit about which one is correct. Is it A, scalable cloud service for web apps that require server-side rendering? Or is it B, a variation of Azure Functions which supports Angular and React? Or C, combination of Azure Functions and Azure SQL Database? Or is it D, a combination of static web apps and serverless APIs? Now, let's examine these statements a little bit. Let's have a look at B, for example. It's saying it's supporting Angular and React. So last time I checked, I think static web apps supported quite a lot of frameworks on top of Angular and React. So I'm wondering if that one is it is true, but there should be more to it because it's supporting Svelte and a lot of other, Gatsby, a lot of other frameworks. I would say in C, you can use whatever database you want, really, right? I mean, we definitely have Azure Functions in there, but it's not locked into Azure SQL. So I'm wondering if C is also incorrect. Is it a combination of static web apps and serverless APIs? Well, in a sense, but so how about this? How about we have a look at the answer and see what they had in mind?
I like, Chris, that process of elimination. That's my tactic with these as well. I went for the B first too. I was like, oh no, there's a bunch of other frameworks. So.
Yeah, for sure. So one note though about the server-side rendering, you tend to deploy applications that are very client-side, but I think you could, in theory, have some kind of server-side rendering if you wanted to from the Azure Functions API, but I don't think that's how it's meant to work. So yeah, I would be on the safe side here with D, right? So this one is important. This is what Sarah just covered for you all. What information is contained in the GitHub workflow file for an Azure Static Web App? Is it A, app location and API location in the repository? Or is it B, app location, API location, and secret stored in plain text? Or is it C, app location, API location, and references to secrets? Or is it D, app location, API location, and subscription ID? Now, Sarah, what do you think about these options? Anyone feel more like inclined to be this one, or?
Well, you know, I like my process of elimination here. So let's see here. Contained in the GitHub workflow file. So let's look at A, app location and API location in the repository. I feel like that is probably true, but I don't think that's everything. So I don't think it's A. So what's your elimination here?
So I'm pretty sure that B is wrong because secrets are not stored in plain text in the configuration files. They are in the secrets compartment of the repo, so I think we can throw that one out. As for C, could possibly be correct, right? Because we have the app location as part of the workflow file, we have the API location, and we have a reference to secrets. I would say that's correct. I'm pretty sure D is incorrect too, because I don't remember in the workflow file that you do any kind of reference to subscription ID. So yeah, I would say that I'm inclined to say C. What do you say?
Yes, I'm thinking the same thing. I think that's our winner.
Ooh, applause to us. We get to keep our jobs, right? Right. So now that we saw some knowledge checks and hopefully you were all with us, Sarah's going to take it away to our second exercise. And yeah, we're going to look at how we can be deploying the Azure Static Web App. So yeah, I'm just going to move us around here in the Learn module to the second exercise.
Perfect.
And just highlight the fact that you have all three deployment languages. I know you've seen Node.js so far, but you can really choose C#, Node.js, Python. Choose your own adventure for this.
Yes, and I like that aspect about it because we're all comfortable in a different language, and you have those options here. Okay, so kind of like we just talked through this a little bit. This exercise here is going to have you going to Static Web Apps. So the first thing you have to do is launch the Azure portal, which that button will just take you right there. Then you can go in and do a search, find Static Web Apps. A lot of this is going to give you, it does a great job here in the instructions about giving you the information to enter and how to get that created. See here some highlights for you. I think the big thing here is it gives you the number 6 there, right? We're going to sign in with GitHub. This is where some of that workflow magic starts to happen. So this is where you say, I'm going to authenticate with GitHub. I'm going to tell you which repository you're connected to. And then what the end goal here is it's going to create that workflow file that will do the auto deploys and that all that great stuff for us. So again, we're just going to kind of log in with GitHub. It tells you you might need a password, which I think was true for me. Then it gives us some more information about what we need to enter. I'm going to skip down a little bit to 9 where it says custom in the build presets.
Ooh, I have a question there. Do we have time for a question? So they're selecting custom here. So if they're not selecting custom, what could they be choosing instead? And why is some other options good and in what scenario?
Oh, this is a good question. So I can't remember offhand all of the other options there, but what they're going to do is we're built to support different deployments, right? So it could be that there's different workflow files for different technologies. So a lot of those we try to pre-bake up for you, so you don't have to give the specifics. If we already know, we want to help you out, and we don't want you to have to, worry about those settings. So some of those we just take care of for you.
Oh, that sounds really great, because I remember working with both Angular and React, and I could never remember the name of that deployment directory. I always have to like, was it deployed or is it
Yeah.
build or is it called, So
Right.
I really appreciate that, the Static Web Apps team is doing all that heavy lifting for me. But I think the reason why we're using custom here, right, is because we have a fairly simple application of an HTML file, right?
Yes. So if we want to go, Chris, if you want to open up, we can look at it. Calls here application app location for the client and the API. So if yes, Chris, let's take a look at that.
Yeah, so here.
Excellent. So in this sample here, we've got API and client, which you may hit a lot in what you're doing. They could be separate repos. In our case, they're combined into one. So if we look, let's go to client. So client is going to be what we're deploying to the front end. And just like you mentioned there, Chris, we just have an indexed HTML file. So for our client app, this is it. This is what we're looking at here. So when we are telling the static web app which the location is, this is where we're pointing it to. And
Nice.
then yes, API is what's going to go to the Azure function.
Oh, cool. So oh yeah, I can see here I have different options of languages, so that's good. So I would just need to hit API / whatever flavor I want, right?
Yes, exactly. So, and yeah, but I think it tells us in the instructions here that it's going to go to client, and then in our case, I think we did node. So, yep, just like you
Yep,
mentioned, API node.
very nice.
Yes. And then I always say, like, when you create resources, I love the review and create option, which is perfect for me because I inevitably have mistyped something. So I like that it gives you the review screen, then you can create that right from there if everything looks good. And then it gives you the option to go to the resource, which is always helpful. It'll show you the steps on how it's deployed, and then it will give you the button right there to go and check it out.
It's like those prompts you get, like when you try to install something, it says like, "Are you sure?" And then there's almost like there's a prompt that says, "Are you really, really sure?" Right?
Yes, I need that when I commit code that says, Sarah, did you leave a council login again?
Or is there a space in my YAML?
Right, you're right.
I think so that was the exercise, right?
Yeah, so that part of the exercise is fairly straightforward. It gives you the steps. The goal of this is that we've got a deployed static web app. Like we just kind of looked at real briefly, it's an HTML file. There's some vanilla JavaScript in there, CSS, and then we use OpenLayer because we want to have the mapping so we can see the bus routes and how that looks. We're going to layer that on top of each other.
Okay, so quick question there. Does my app work at this point? What will I see if I were to render the app at this point?
Oh, I think you just may see. This is a good question, Chris. Um, Probably just see a map, I think, with probably not much on it because we haven't connected it to our API yet.
Ah, okay, but the API is there. So where is the break in the connection? What can't the API do and why?
So what we need to do next is we need to tell our front end on how to access our database, and how we're going to do that is through that oh gosh, I loved how you phrased it, that gooey, yummy middle cake layer because it has the frosting on both sides, right?
Right, right.
Excellent. So yeah, so this is where we're gonna, this is what we got to get to, right? So I love this front end layer. So, the top layer of the cake, sometimes has extra frosting, so it can be also very special. This is what we're looking at here. Uh, all right, so we look at our HTML file. What we're going to see here is a fetch. So what we want to do is we want to fetch to our endpoint. So we want to call our endpoint and get the data that we need to map that where the bus location is and where our geofence is. So we've got a little sample of what that code looks like. This isn't in the module, not something you need to get in and write or update. It's just more we want to kind of raise awareness of how this is working. So we've got some IDs here. We'll look at this real quickly. Right, we've got some IDs that we want to search for, and then API URL. We're going to get the API bus data. We're going to give it the IDs we want to look for. And now, Chris, I see a $sign here, and I've spent many amazing hours with this little $sign. So $.get.json, I know that's jQuery.
Right. You know, it's funny about jQuery because I think a lot of people forget what jQuery did for all of us back in the days, right? I remember being on having to support several browsers, right? I was supporting Firefox, Internet Explorer 6, and whatever else these browsers were called. And I'd like to say that we are where we are today, where all the vendors are in agreement what the API should be. They were not. So for me, jQuery was a godsend, right? You had this top layer library that just made it easier to do whatever I needed, right? I could get an element in one way, I could do web requests. And yeah, so I kind of see jQuery as, are there modern browsers that support fetch? Yes, there are. Are still a lot of systems using jQuery and it works for them? Also true, right? So I kind of see the usage of jQuery here as a nod to all of you who are still supporting all of these systems, and almost like a tribute to thank you jQuery because you were there for us when we needed it. But yeah, I just want to call out that there is support in modern browsers for fetch. So if you take this code, you want to just replace it with fetch, definitely do that. Just this is my way of saying respect your elders. You agree, Sarah?
Yes, like I mentioned, I've spent many hours with the $sign, and I loved it because the fact I could have an HTML page and I could import jQuery, and all of a sudden I've got all these functions and things. It was definitely my gateway into modern day frameworks. And it's just one solution, like you mentioned, Chris. This is just one possible solution for this. And I like that the module kind of does a little nod to that historical significance of jQuery. Is fun, and it's a little bit of a throwback for me. It's great.
For sure.
All right, so then from that call, right, looks like, Chris, we're getting some bus data back to the application. So tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so we're looking at JSON data. So at this point, the frontend has called the API, and the API has called a store procedure on our database. And back comes this JSON. So there's a bus data where the bus is physically at. And then there's the geofence, which essentially, as you were saying before, Sarah, is drawing up that perimeter that tells us, okay, if you're within this perimeter, you're probably going to make the bus if you just go from walking to light jog at least, right? So yeah, this is the JSON data that will serve front end essentially.
Excellent. And this is gonna, yes, like you said, it'll give us our points, and we'll draw it on the map. We've got our fence. We know where our bus is. So now, Chris, so now I'm thinking we've got the front end app. It's fetching the data. If we go to that app now, will we see all of the data populating? I think you mentioned something about serverless earlier.
Yeah, correct. So if we were to go to this application currently, even if we were to, even if the API were able to reach the database, it wouldn't actually work, right? Because as you said there, Sarah, the serverless mode means that we haven't talked to this database in a while, so it's probably asleep. So you need to wake it up with a request, right? So this is kind of known in cloud land as a cold start, so we'll need a few seconds to wake up. But I do believe we have an exercise first where we need to set the an application setting for our app first before we can try that out. But that's really a good call out to kind of set our expectations right. Assume it's not going to work. If it works, you're a genius, right?
Yes.
Right. So I don't think we have so much time for knowledge check at this point, so I'm just going to fast power through these, but we will move into the last exercise just to set up the app, right?
Yes.
So quickly, what we're doing here, we are nearing the end of this presentation, so I think we just need to somewhat quickly state what we are doing here to make things work, right?
Yes. So this is, again, this is some steps. They're pretty straightforward. what we're going to do here is we're going to get the connection string to our database, and it's going to have you go back into Portal. And for the Azure Static Web Apps, we looked a little bit about secrets earlier in GitHub. You also have some configurations on your Azure Static Web App that will kind of hold those values for you as well that you can access. So what we're doing basically is we're going to take that connection string and we're going to tell our Azure Static Web Apps about it. And then that's going to take that and it can include it in the application so that we can actually see the data and it can access it.
Oh, nice. So assume that we have set this connection string in our app settings. Our app should be working, right? I mean, you were alluding to the fact that it might not be working. So let's see what's going on here. So this is the database resource that we're using for this live application. And what we can try to do is to look at our live app, just to see if we reload it. And it's actually working, but you might be in situations that Sarah was saying where the database actually powered down and it would say like it's paused. If that happens, just go into your app, shoot off a request, go back in here and make sure it says it going from paused to actually working. So yeah, never worry about if your database is down. It just means you need to wake it up, right? You know, just like myself or Sarah, we're sometimes sleepy. We need that instant caffeine. So
Yes.
I believe we are at the point now where we've done all the important parts of our app, right? We have a front end, we have a middle part, we have a back end, and maybe someone back home is preparing a cake for no apparent reason. I don't know.
I could
so
only
Sarah,
hope.
maybe you want to. Sarah, maybe you want to conclude. What have we learned today?
Yes. So today we were able to get a static web app created, which was kind of the goal of this module. And to get that done, we built out a database and an API to support that because we needed the data to display on that. So we could see that working web app. And I also think it's cool that it's a static web app, right? But you're getting dynamic data from it. And then we also looked at the GitHub Actions and built out those CI/CD pipelines so we can have the auto deployment because who doesn't love things automatically happening for you?
No, exactly. So I'm kind of impressed how, you know, GitHub Actions is really working with me, and the fact that once I deploy things, right, it's just a one-off, because all the future changes I do, I only need to work with Git. You know, I do my changes, I deploy whatever I need to Git, and off these actions go and redeploy things. And that's what I really, really love about static web apps, to be honest. I'm not just saying this because I'm working for Microsoft. This is a fantastic service. So if you haven't given it a chance before, definitely try it out, right? Because it's just you and Git, and how bad can that be? Well,
Right.
I take that back. Git is and can be difficult sometimes, but you know what I mean, right? If it's one problem less, if you don't have to care so much about the cloud, happy days, right?
Yes, it was actually it was very helpful just recently in a hackathon. The team and I, we were continuously getting changes out there and having that pipeline always doing that work for us saved us a lot of time and made progress. And not only then, but just helps in everyday development, how you can set those up and tweak them to be beneficial for your team is good stuff.
Nice.
All right. So I know we
yeah,
just have a couple minutes left. Yeah. So here's go ahead, Chris. This is the link to our Learn module, correct?
Yeah, for sure. So either scan the QR code or check out the link, whatever is easiest for you. And as you saw, this is part of a learning path, right? Which means that definitely take this module, but also look around, right? Because at the top link there for your module, you have the ability to explore so many related full stack application scenarios. Because at the end of the day, you know, if an app doesn't have a data store, it's kind of a toy app, right? You need it to have an API, you need it to have a database. And here we're showing you the full stack, the full working app that maybe, just maybe, you can actually take a bus in Seattle and make it, right?
Yes, without running, hopefully.
For sure. And yeah, quick reminder, this is our module. Again, build full stack applications with Azure Static Web Apps and Azure SQL Database. And I think I need a mental break after reading that title. It's very descriptive, I'll tell you that much. Huge thank you to all our listeners in this cast. Myself, Sarah, we thank all of you, and I hope you asked a lot of really great questions to Simona Kutin, the program manager on Azure Static Web Apps team. So bring all your complicated questions. That's what she's here for. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of Build.